in the hedge between the house next door and ours. And, you know, I was just a young child, and you don't think about where a plant comes from. You're just more concerned with the smell of it, or, you know, there are insects visiting it, or playing with the plants. And it wasn't until, and I did learn the name of the plant, and in the interim I went to art college and then studied horticulture. But it wasn't until I moved here, and I love hiking and climbing and doing mountaineering, that I realized, wow, this is a wild plant from here, you know, and you see it growing up the mountains. It's not a garden plant. And I love history, and also, you know, my impulse wherever I live, in order to feel at home there, I want to learn the history of the place, and I usually start with the plants. And of course, I have learned my history of Oregon through the plants, really. That's my in to history. And a few years ago, I created my first version of this talk, and it ended up being like a laundry list of plants, you know, I'm very grateful to my family telling me that there was too much information, you know, and just my daughter in particular saying, you know, you need to take this out and put that in. But in the interim too, we've had so much happen in our lives between George Floyd's death and the racial reckoning, and just this growing awareness of the racial inequalities and whose story is included or not included in the history, as well as having a pandemic. So, you know, they say history repeats itself, but so you might hear things that remind you of what's going on now. And also to start, and just making sure I know how to use this, hold on. So here we have where I'm from, Ireland originally, and I come from a little place called Tullamore, right in the middle there, but spent most of my life nearly in Dublin, though, in college and working, which is where my husband is from. This story actually starts a long time ago, and I just want to point out that you can see this is a modern map, and there's a red line here, and that's sort of the new Northern Ireland, or relatively new. It's 100 years old now to the year when it was created, and it's this northeast corner. But when I'm mostly telling this story, there was no such thing as Northern Ireland. Ireland is all just part of Great Britain, or part of the empire. And this really is a story about empire as well. So let's see if I can get this to work. Can I turn?
I don't know how to do that.
The little sign.
Yeah.
Yeah, why is it doing that? Operation is on by switch. Excuse us. So anyway, while he's fixing, so this story really starts, so the story roughly starts about 200 years ago, and then some. And in 1995, I went back to college, and I went to the National Botanic Gardens in Dublin. It's called Glasnevin, it's well known as. And they were celebrating, I didn't realize I was there at the 200th anniversary of the foundation of this Botanic Gardens. And that's the period that, you know, I'm really starting to tell this story about how the red flowering currant got to Ireland. And this man here, John Foster, was the Speaker of the Irish Parliament. He was also a huge, you know, at the time, all the great, he was a huge property owner. Ireland was part of the empire, and we had been well and truly colonized, so he was one of the landed elite, you know, the Anglo-Irish ascendancy, as we call them. And he was a huge, you know, he had a huge collection of plants in his, on his estate, something like 1,700. And then many of them were North American plants. And then he was one of the founding members of the Botanic Gardens. And even back then, 200 years ago, they had about 200 North American trees and 200 North American herbaceous plants, even in the very beginning. But I would say most of those are from the eastern United States, because as we know, the United States was that eastern half at that stage. And this place we now call Oregon was indigenous territory, you know, had very little contact with Europeans or Euro-Americans. Let me just check. Yes, and when it first started, the Botanic Gardens was really into just agricultural plants, but within 30 years or so, they started saying, no, they went into botanical research, And then they started connecting with the other botanic gardens that are part of the system of Great Britain, the Royal Botanical Gardens like Edinburgh and Oxford and Kew, which was just being formed as well. And so they start sharing plants, and Ireland's botanic gardens benefited as much from any plants that came in from from explorations like the other botanic gardens. And the bigger context for that is that this is the British Empire, and Britain was the most powerful commercial, industrial, and colonial power in the world at that time. And they have this huge network on the first, they have a Royal Navy, and that's the most powerful in the world. And they also have, I don't remember, the Hudson's Bay Company, which is more, it was what is now Canada, but it was the de facto government for Britain in this part of the world. And so Britain could get plants back to England and the rest of Great Britain very efficiently because either with their navy or with the ships of the Hudson's Bay Company. And of course the botanic gardens and horticultural societies really benefited from this. So the whole empire building thing really facilitated plants getting back to Britain. And of course the context here was that, oh, did I go low? Sorry. I am having problems with this.
You want me to try and switch it off to try and get rid of that, or just leave it on? I don't know what's most distracting.
Would you mind if we try and switch it off so that
That would be
we can get rid of
great.
that? Okay.
I might try to be good.
Yeah.
Restart, okay.
Yeah, reboot might be needed.
Why is it doing this?
No.
But anyway, I'll talk about this slide too, just, as you can see, the green area is the United States, and in 1803, there are these statements I know I'm going to make during the course of this, and they just sound absurd to me. So one of them is that Napoleon sold Louisiana to the United States in 1803. The idea of this vast area of land being sold by one emperor to the president of a new United States, complete disregard for all the people who lived there, were not recognized as having any human rights at all, or authority. And of course the map was blank, this whole idea of the blank map, where it's just open for colonization. And Jefferson was also, he was very keen to send Lewis and Clark out west looking for the Northwest Passage. And also he has them surveying plants, they're making maps. He wants, Britain and the United States are really in competition to lay claim to the Western territories, what they called the Oregon Territory at the time, and of course wasn't part of the United States at all. And they think if they make the maps, if they collect the plants and they name them for themselves, all these white guys love naming plants for themselves. Now the protocol is that whoever collects the plant cannot, and documents it for science, they can't name it after themselves. Someone else has to do that. So they're sending them back to, these botanists in England and Scotland who then name, usually they're their pals, they're their colleagues, and they name a lot of them for themselves, so they're naming the plants. And when he gets this back going, you'll see it in this story all the time, the people whose voice and sort of witness is not in it is indigenous people, and it's certainly not women or indigenous women. So when I was trying to redo this talk, I was trying to, how do I include women and how do I include the indigenous voice as well? And it's difficult when most of what we have in archives, and almost by default, all the books and all the documents have been written by mostly white guys, from, Western culture, a different worldview to the indigenous people. But I want to show that, it's coming back up again, I'm hoping I can, that this, the area we're going to talk about, mostly a lot of the plants are collected along the Columbia River is one of the areas. And the Chinook people, their traditional homeland is on the mouth of the Columbia River. And they actually had, they were great trading people, the shrewd traders, and they had influence right up to the Dalles. And this whole area is occupied, you know, and let me try this.
Are you trying to go forward?
Yeah.
Oh, no.
Oh, wait, now have I got it wrong? Yep. Need a magic touch? I don't think you do.
Do you
I
want to
have to
just
go
have
here.
the, can you have the laptop up there
Can
and
you go
just
back to
advance it that
manual?
way?
What did you do?
I'll do it.
Okay, so, okay, you go to that one, you just, the map one. Go forward, you're going backwards. Next one. Okay, so in an effort to sort of illustrate this, I love this quote that I've seen it on one of them, a member of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, I think it's David Harrelson. He has all land is indigenous land, and so what you have over here on the right is an 1841 map, which is a bit later than the main collecting period I'm talking about. But you can see Charles Wilkes, who was with the U.S., he was a U.S. naval officer, he's trying to put in the names of different indigenous groups, and he has the Kalapuya and the Chinook and the Malala and all of these. But the thing that they didn't understand was that there, you know, it wasn't property like, you know, in our idea of the world, and boundaries changed, and it depended if you had kinships and marriages, and you know, it was a shifting area that would be the homeland. And also the people didn't stay put in one. Often they said this is their land if the first time Europeans had contact with them when they were in a certain place, but they all had these rounds, you know, seasonal rounds, and they moved around. They might have their winter village, but anyway, just to show that Wilkes was grappling with it and trying to identify where they were. And this is a modern map giving us an idea of the incredible diversity of the indigenous people of this area. And also there is a project I heard about with the Confederate Tribes of the Grand Ronde called decolonizing maps, because I'd say maps were a great tool for colonizing, and the plant collectors used them to show, you know, where they found the plants and in their journals. But now the, you know, the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, at least they're using these maps to try and get some of their own history and, you know, sort of pull things out that they can learn more, or, you know, find ways of including themselves in the map. So if you can go ahead. And before I just want to say something about the words we use, and I know you'll all know this and you're very familiar with it. But you know, how we talk about native plants matters, and I realize I've had to change and notice how I talk about them. And I just want to talk about even one word, the word discovered. That, and you can see the Lewis and Clark is the core of discovery. But in fact, what's happened is it isn't. We didn't discover the plants, or the plant collectors I'm going to talk about. They didn't discover them. They just described them for the first time for Western science, or documented them. And they weren't the first adults to see or collect or eat the plants, you know. And it's no accident that this word discovered is so prevalent, because I don't know if you've ever heard of the doctrine of discovery. And this goes way back to like the 15th century, where European monarchies, they sort of promulgated this law that said that if any land they travel to that's not Christian, and they're the first Europeans to get there, well then they own it. They kind of have right to colonize it. And it's this pseudo crazy idea, and it's for them, they said it was a law, and it's called the doctrine of discovery, and it isn't some arcane law, because when it came to the time that the US, you know, had their, you know, your War of Independence with England or Britain, and you know, created the United States, Jefferson used that supposed precedent to say, well, Britain had right to North America in the doctrine of discovery, so now because we've beaten them, we have it. And so, but and it's, believe it or not, I came across a reference that it was cited or referenced in 2005 in the Supreme Court in America. And I couldn't figure out, because I didn't have enough information, well, which way were they arguing. But even the UN and other human rights bodies are all saying, can we please stop this use of discovery, because it completely denies the rights of indigenous people. So just to say that, you know, even it seems like we're just doing science when we're collecting plants, but science isn't neutral, and how we describe, you know, the history of the plant collecting really has this implicit bias, Western bias in it, that we're trying to grapple with today. And I also just want to make, here's a page from Captain Clark's journal, and I'm sure that's tall or engraved, which I think is kind of nice. And you know, all of these educated plant collectors are writing their journals, and they're giving their, you know, they're giving their Western version of who the people are. We don't hear, you know, what the women thought or the indigenous men thought, you know, or the culture. It's always, I think it's like a Western gaze, you know, recording of who they are. And, okay, so next one. And I really want to just mention, you know, to dial in on this just for a second. Of course, I love this plant, the common camas, beautiful member of the lily family. And also that, you know, this is in 2002, this was minted, this golden dollar with Sacagawea on it. Now, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing her name right, but now we don't know what she looked like. There is no record of, you know, her, even though her husband, there's an image of him seemingly in their, you know, paintings of Lewis and Clark. So it's all, you know, like a creative imagining in modern days of what she might have looked like. And this map shows again, the core of discovery, you know, the trip they took. And just to point out that, you know, she is, as my daughter said, she's a bit like Joan of Arc in America, isn't she? I mean, she's so well known and she's so well loved, but she's like the exception that proves the rule, because apart from Pocahontas, I don't know any other indigenous women that have really, and I'm not saying that, you know, my knowledge is exhaustive, but just in what I've learned in the 20 years I've lived here. And, but she's a symbol of what, I mean, it's the women who were tending the food, who knew the plants, and were digging up the plants. And there's an account where they're just over on the western side of the Rockies, and the core is starving to death, and they're down to eating the tallow from their candles. They've no food. And she recognizes camas growing. Now you have to remember, she was a 12-year-old that was kidnapped and enslaved, and moved over to the Mandan village, which I think now is in the Dakotas. You might know your geography better than me. And she is several years later, but she starts digging up camas, and she digs up other root plants, and she basically cooks them and saves them from starvation. But so all the indigenous women did this. I mean, so Lewis and Clark, their idea of agriculture is to see crops in a row, but they didn't realize that when they're looking at the camas, they're looking at a crop. They're looking at a staple food that has been tended, and you know, the women had a system for you know, planning and carrying out, you know, a way of growing them and tending them that they didn't recognize. And of course, coming from a Western patriarchal worldview of women, you know, with these gender roles, they certainly didn't think of women being the providers of the main food, you know. And so I just wanted to remember that when we get into the story of all the plant collectors, they wouldn't have been as successful as they were if they didn't have the generosity and weren't welcomed by the indigenous people who shared their knowledge, and often the women and the children, and then collected the plants for them that they gathered. So you can thank you. Oh, so who are the plant collectors? Well, I've already mentioned Lewis and Clark, and of course they survived, got all the way over to the west coast and back, and they brought back all these plants. And they had plants that they had pressed into herbarium specimens, you know, like the way you dry them, but they also brought back live plants, or seeds and berries, and that would then, the plan was, Jefferson had given them, you know, their instructions that we want to catalog all these plants and to publish a really definitive flora of the United States or North America as a way of claiming credibility as a new nation, and that we've got scientists, and you know, and of course botany was the cutting edge of science at the time. So this was a really important collection, and the idea was that Lewis was supposed to catalog them, and write up the book, and it was to be published. But before I get totally into the story, I want to mention that the two people, and in fact, the person who's best known for plant collecting out here is David Douglas, because he collected the most and he introduced them. His main thing was to bring back the live plants, like the seeds, to introduce them into cultivation. But an older generation to him, Archibald Menzies, but in fact his name should be pronounced Mengus, seemingly, so I may go back and forth a bit. I'm trying to relearn how to pronounce his name. He was the earlier generation, and he was one of the earliest Europeans out collecting out in the Pacific Northwest with the Vancouver expedition. But I'll tell you why he isn't so well acknowledged, and I'll tell you the story in a minute. But at first, like, they're Scottish, and you'll see a theme through this. There are an awful lot of Scottish plant collectors, and there's a reason for that. And one of the things I discovered when researching this is that Scotland had this system of education going back to the Reformation, where every boy and some girls could go to a parish school for just ordinary people, you know, the most common or humble people. And they got their 3 Rs, and they got some grounding in classic education. So they were literate. And so they had a complete advantage on a lot of their Irish and English and Welsh peers. They were, and the reason why the girls sometimes got the education was, I was trying to, find out, was that if they didn't have enough boys in the school, then they'd let the girls come in to make up the numbers. So anyway, some of the girls got it. So the Scottish really are, feature in this story. And I'm going to start with Archibald Menzies, and he came from pretty humble beginnings, and his father was the head gardener at Menzies Castle. Now, he would have been a distant relative to the lord of the manor, the castle. But and all his brothers were gardeners too. And this is the thing, at this time, if you wanted to be a successful gardener in the British Isles or Great Britain, you had to be Scottish. Everyone wanted Scottish gardeners. They had the reputation, I don't know what the equivalent would be today, but they had the market cornered, and they had the network because all their brothers were gardeners and their fathers were gardeners, and if there was a job opening, they'd get the job. And they had a reputation for being really stoic, hardworking, abstemious, just really good people for the job. But when he eventually his brother got him a job at the Botanic Gardens in the University of Edinburgh, and he was noticed by the professor of botany there in the School of Medicine, who encouraged him to become a surgeon. So again, you have a pretty humble person managing to get a 3rd level education. And I was fascinated to discover that at the time, the University of Edinburgh's School of Medicine was the best in the world. It was, where you went to study medicine. But they also then provided a sort of a pipeline of surgeons and doctors for the Royal Navy. So and when you studied to become a surgeon or a doctor, that was the place you studied botany. It was part of your training for becoming a surgeon or a doctor. So you had all these naturalists who were surgeons or doctors, and of course, Menzies loved, he was a naturalist. He got he got jobs as a surgeon in the Royal Navy, and that's how he ended up being able to travel to on Vancouver's expedition into the Pacific Northwest. But in order to get that job, he had a sort of a mentor, and this was Joseph Banks. And it may not be a very good analogy, but I kind of think of him as the kind of Elon Musk of the day, or he was one of the wealthiest men in England. He was completely into science, a man of the Enlightenment, and he had the ear of the king. His friend was the head of the Lord of the Admiralty. So he convinced the Royal Navy that whenever you go on these expeditions, you really need to bring a naturalist, like a scientist, and an artist maybe. And he was on one of Captain Cook's voyages. I don't know, the reason why Botany Bay is called Botany Bay is because of him, because that's where he was botanizing. But he paid his, the Navy wouldn't agree at first. He says, look, I'll pay. So he paid for himself, he paid for artists, he paid for naturalists, and they, so he started this trend, or really getting the Navy to bring these people with them whenever they travel around the world. And there's no coincidence he has the globe, the world behind him. And he was the first unofficial director of Kew Gardens, and he was very ambitious for Kew, that it was going to become the biggest, had the biggest collection of plants in the world, which I think it does. It has something like 8 million today, but this is, Joseph Banks was just very ambitious, and he noticed Archibald Mengus, when he was actually away on one of his Royal Navy duties, he sent plants back to him, and it was Banks who recommended him for the Vancouver voyage. And there was a kind of pros and cons to this, because on the one hand, Mengus was delighted to get on the ship and to be going on this voyage, but Banks kind of owned him, if you know what I mean. He was his patron, and he said, you're going to do this, this, and this. And all the plants he collected, and this is one of the reasons why he didn't get the sort of credit he deserves, because everything he collected went back to Banks. And Banks had it in his herbarium in his house. And he was probably thinking of, Kew Gardens. And seemingly Mengus is a very humble, modest man, and he never, got the acclaim that he should have got for having actually collected all these plants originally, and then, though his name is on a few things, of course, that we will recognize. But the person who's best known is David Douglas, of course. And again, he's the next generation to Mengus. And he comes from an even more humble background. His father was a stonemason in Scotland in a place called Scone. And again, he hated school, gets apprenticed to become a gardener, and then he makes his way up through gardens, and he eventually gets a job in the Botanic Gardens, the new Botanic Gardens in Glasgow University, or they're associated with the University of Glasgow. He's noticed by this man, William Jackson Hooker, who is this, I would say, wonderful teacher of botany. He was in, again, the School of Medicine, and a wonderful botanical artist as well. And his lectures are really popular, and people who aren't even studying medicine end up sitting in on them. And even Douglas, as a sort of a humble gardener, is able to sit in on these lectures, and he ends up going with, Hooker brings all his students off on these field trips around Scotland, and Douglas comes with them and is learning all about the plants. But I'm always really amazed by Douglas's journals. Just, he's come from a very humble background, but how, when he writes his journals, his English, he writes well. He is has an insatiable curiosity, and is just wants to know everything about nature, and he just loves plants. And again, it's in 1823 he makes his first trip to the United States, but it's to eastern United States. He gets his first job with the Horticultural Society of London, who end up being the Royal Horticultural Society. Eventually, you might know them as the RHS. And yeah, so that's how he gets going in plant exploration. And now I'm going to try and tell you more of the story through some of the plants. And one of the surprises to me was that the Oregon state flower, in fact, its scientific name is the name for an Irishman. And I didn't know that before I came here, and I remember someone telling me something about it. So, and by telling the story of Mahonia, or tall Oregon grape, all these different botanists, plant collectors, they're all connected to this plant. And it also gives you an idea of the competition between Britain and the US, and Jefferson's ambitions for publishing this great flora of the Lewis and Clark expedition. So Bernard McMahon, we don't know much about him except that he somehow by the late 1700s, he was somewhere in the northern part of Ireland, and by 1800, he had established a really successful seed nursery in Philadelphia. And all these different botanists like Thomas Nuttall and Darlington would hang out there around the hot stove, seemingly, in his store. So he also published this book called The American Garden Calendar, and it was the first of its kind in the United States. When it was really successful, And that's how he got into correspondence with Thomas Jefferson, and they became friends and would correspond about plants. But he also published the first catalogue of native plant seeds, which I find really interesting, in the United States. So, yeah. So I'm going to apologize for how the next slide looks, but I couldn't think of any other way to kind of tell you the story of Mahonia. So, but you know, so you have Jefferson gets Lewis and Clark to collect all these plants. But the United States is a really young country. It doesn't already have the institutions to process these plants when they all come back from their big expedition. So the dried specimens, the herbarium specimens, go to this Professor Benjamin Smith Barton. It's in Philadelphia. And the seeds actually go to Bernard McMahon and a couple of others. And he successfully propagates the Mahonia, or germinates it, propagates it, grows the plant in secret, because these are owned by the US government, remember, these plants. Meanwhile, Smith Barton, who's supposed to be a really tough character to work with, he's supposed to be working with Lewis to publish the flora, and it's going slow. And Frederick Persch, who's a young German botanist, is employed to help with the job and doesn't get on with Smith Barton and is frustrated. And tragically, of course, Lewis dies. You know, he commits suicide. And Clark is put in charge of looking after the plants. But eventually, Frederick Persch is working and working and working on these plants, but he isn't getting paid. So McMahon takes pity on him, and he goes to live with McMahon. And he has all the herbarium specimens there, and he's working away. But he never finds out that the actual live plants, the Mahonia, is actually growing in the nursery somehow. He never goes out there. And we don't know what he looks like, but I'm putting in this plant for his portrait because it's named for a Persia tritonella. So that's, and it's one of his illustrations, so from the flora. So ultimately, Persch gets totally fed up, and he absconds to England with all the plants, the herbarium specimens. And in 1811, he goes to England, brings it all with him. And by 1813, he has published the book that Jefferson wanted published in the US. He's published it in London, much to the consternation of the young US. And interestingly, you can see he's calling it Berberis aquifolium. Now, you know, people, the explanation I've been given for why this plant has two scientific names is that botanists say Berberis, but in horticulture it's called Mahonia. So I don't know. I've only ever really heard it called Mahonia, but I do see it, but he's calling it Berberis. And but he doesn't quite have the last word. So in a few years after that, Thomas Nuttall, who was one of the botanists, used to hang out with Bernard McMahon, who was a good friend. He actually managed to somehow to publish a flora in the US, calling it the Genera of North American Plants in 1818. And it's 2 years after Bernard McMahon had died. So he memorializes his friend by changing the name of tall Oregon grape from Berberis to Mahonia aquifolium. So that's the story. Let me see if I missed anything to tell you. No, we'll move on. So, but ultimately, how the plant gets to, the live plant gets to Great Britain and to Ireland is that David Douglas, on his first trip, you know, with the Horticulture Society to the New York, New Jersey, that part of the world, he brings back Mahonia from a nursery in New York, I think it was. But he also visited McMahon's nursery, and I often wonder, well, did he bring it from there, or did he bring some of the plants that actually would have been the ones that Bernard McMahon had propagated, you know? And anyway, I don't know. But I didn't say a word about the botanical illustrations I'm using in this talk. They're not random. I'm trying to use the ones that are actually contemporaneous with the person I'm talking about. And if you see, this was published in Curtis Botanical Magazine in 1823, which is the year that David Douglas was in New York and brought the plant back. And often, and you botanical artists here, you look at something like this and you say, well, did they draw it from life or did they draw it from a herbarium specimen? And I've come to the conclusion that they couldn't have propagated and grown the Mahonia in months to look like this So he must have worked from a herbarium specimen, and then they had to wait for the seeds to be grown into new plants. But it was one of the plants that David Douglas, one of his earliest plants, along with red flowering currant, that he introduced into Great Britain from the 1820s. And as I was saying, like there's no way he's the most successful person who's introduced maybe the most plants from this part of the world single-handedly into Great Britain and Ireland. And he couldn't have done it without the cooperation of the people, of the Pacific Northwest, the indigenous people, and that's, we can go on to the next. I'd like to talk for a minute about this person. So Chief Comcomly, and he was this very important chief at the mouth of the Chinook chief at the mouth of the Columbia River, and he had met Lewis and Clark. I think he had met Robert Gray too, who was the first person to come up the Columbia River and for whom it is named because his ship was called the Columbia. He just was this diplomat that met every sort of visiting European or Euro-American ship, and he was about making peace. He was a really shrewd trade person, and he was really interested in doing trade and not in it, and was very generous and welcomed them. And he would come out with his big canoes and all his warriors and visit the ships and bring gifts whenever somebody turned up at the mouth of the river. And he also, he had lots of children too, and this is one of them, I think it's Ilki, it's pronounced. Again, we don't know what they look like. And he would form alliances with all, we had like the Hudson's Bay Company, but before that we had the Pacific Company, which was J.J. Astor, and his daughters married members of, they would have been Scots, Hudson Bay people, they would have been US citizens, or a lot of them were Scottish, or Scottish, French, Canadian, because they had come from what is now Canada, trading for furs and running these companies like the Hudson Bay and the Pacific Company. And so, when we talk about all these guys that came to collect plants here, and they met members of these Hudson Bay Company, which was the de facto government sort of in the area later on, there were families there. It wasn't just all guys, they had wives and they had children, and often they had married indigenous women like Chinook women like Ilki, or they married what they called métis or mixed blood, women who were part French Canadian and part maybe one of the Iroquois from back east. I mean, it was a very diverse group at that time, and there were Hawaiians there too that had been brought by the Pacific Company to work there. So, it wasn't just all European and Euro-American men, just to get that point across. And women are not, we don't have many images for women, and I'm trying to be careful about the ones I use, but I really sort of want to name them or have some kind of visual representation for them that they're included in the picture. Because again, they were the ones who know the plants and are teaching, really, the visitors about the environment as well, and the plants, and feeding them. And I've included this picture of a little Chinook Indian girl, but it's from 1909, and it's one of Edward Curtis's photographs. He went and photographed, and I'm kind of careful about my selection of those because he really romanticized, indigenous people. He would manipulate and get them to pose this way and get them to wear that and everything. And I mean, they're beautiful photos, but they are very romantic version of his view of what they should look like. And I always think it's kind of ironic that he's doing all these beautiful pictures as he sees them of the indigenous people well after they're any threat to anybody, because they've already been colonized and forced off their land, and all this kind of thing. So it's kind of bittersweet. But anyway, the reason why I have her into it is because at one stage, Comcomly welcomed David Douglas into his village and his area, and he fed him and he helped him find plants. And at one stage, Douglas was admiring one of these lovely woven hats, and he asked, that is Chinook design. I was thinking of Greg Archuleta the other night. I'm sure he's doing contemporary, he knows about the basketry and the weaving. And so Douglas asked him, well, could I have some, please? And Con Comley got his 12-year-old daughter to weave him these hats, several examples, and he said, oh, could you get one with a brim on it too? So, he even had him adopt one. And it was months later, maybe his next trip, Con Comley came up to Fort Vancouver, where Douglas was staying in the Hudson's Bay headquarters there on the river, and delivered these hats that his 12-year-old daughter had, made, beautiful. And the reason, another reason I think that Douglas was so successful too was that he stayed on the land. And I have my own personal theory that Douglas and Mengus were bilingual. They were Scots Gaelic. They had their native tongue, Scots Gaelic and English. And I actually think that it kind of made them more predispositioned to learning some of the languages of the region. And in Chinook, there's Chinook Wawa, which they used to call Chinook jargon, and it was the lingua franca of the area, and in fact a much wider area. And it was the trade, because this was a huge hub for trade along the Columbia River, and lots of different tribes. Before any kind of European or Euro-American contact, they had this Chinook Wawa that they used to communicate with each other for trade, all the different tribes. And Douglas learned it pretty well. He was pretty good at it, and I think that really helped him as well with communicating and finding out about the plants and getting the plants, and the help and the cooperation. And I'm sure the women were teaching him the language too. So I think that some of you can. So and as an example, the word for this is salal, which is the very first plant I think he saw when he eventually got off the ship on his first expedition to the Pacific Northwest. Because Mengus had told him about it, he said, oh, there's this plant growing everywhere, and he was thrilled to see it. And when he heard the Chinook telling him the name of the plant, he heard salal, which if you look, the Chinook word for it is like kicked salal, and whereas the Lewis and Clark it was who gave the name Gaultheria Shalon, and I think they didn't hear it as clearly as Douglas did. And then here I'm going to tell you. Yeah, so when he was doing this botanizing for the first time, he had a companion with him, another young Scottish man called John Scholar, he was barely 20 years of age, and he was the surgeon on the ship. So, but then he was a naturalist, and the two of them were doing the botanizing and marveling over the salal. But Scholar had to leave, to head back to Britain. But he did bring back plants, I think, and seeds for Douglas. And he also was a student of William Jackson Hooker, the professor who had taught them all in medicine at the University of Glasgow. And he has in his journal that as soon as a couple of years later, he's visiting William Jackson Hooker in Glasgow, and he sees the salal growing in seedlings. He's shown them in a greenhouse. And that's the thing that amazes me, like this system of the Royal Navy and the Hudson Bay Company ships, how quickly they got these plants back and growing and out into cultivation. Because, these plants were really important, like the people who subscribed or financed a lot of botanic gardens and horticultural societies were the very wealthy landlords, particularly in Scotland. They wanted the plants for their own estates, both as ornamental plants, but also for cash, commercial timber plants. And of course, they had these huge estates with their hunting grounds, and they wanted plants to put on them. And the salal was introduced so that the pheasant and grouse could hide in them. But I don't recall ever seeing any salal in Ireland for the same thing, and I've hiked everywhere. But they are an invasive species for that reason now in Scotland, because they're too successful. So anyway, okay, and now I'm going to talk a little bit about trees as well. So we all know our stake tree, which sort of has both Douglas and Mengus in it, in the common name and the botanical name. And this tree, and the lords with their properties, they really wanted commercial timber. At this time, both Ireland and Scotland were completely denuded of trees. And the story goes in Ireland, the one that we blame Britain and Queen Elizabeth I, that she cut down all our trees to build her navies, you know, and all our ships. But there is, I don't know if that's overstated, but there's a certain amount of truth in it, because even the Royal Navy at the time, they were looking for trees that they could bring back to Ireland to grow so they could build ships for their Royal Navy. And so they're always on the lookout for really good trees. And the Douglas fir was one of those trees that was brought back by Douglas as early as, you know, 1830s, I say 1820s. They were planted out in these big, particularly in Scotland, because of course he's Scottish and he has that network, and they end up in these big estates in Scotland growing, okay, as one of the trees. But if I want to talk about Ireland and the one tree from here that has really changed the Irish landscape, I have to talk about the Sitka spruce. And here is, believe it or not, it's one of the two surviving Sitka spruce of Douglas's seedlings in Ireland. And it's claiming to be the tallest tree in Ireland now. But it's in competition with the Douglas fir that's in another famous estate. Like, this is called Curramore Estate in County Waterford, that's the southeast. And there's another beautiful estate. Any of you visit around, you might end up, if you're in the vicinity of Dublin, you may end up going to Powerscourt Garden. And they have a Douglas fir. And it's like they're in competition saying which ones, because they grow at different, it seems to me they're both still growing. And you know, as far as I know, the Sitka spruce is the taller one. And you're going to laugh because it's 180 feet tall. And you know how tall, you know, Doug firs grow here, you know, they grow 200 to 300 feet. But anyway, that's Ireland. But it's very much an ornamental plant here. And I don't have a problem with that. It's kind of in this garden where I can see there's a collection of different kinds of conifers. But the real problem with Sitka spruce in Ireland is, and this is Ireland, is that in the 1950s, the forestry, the new young forestry, the new independent Ireland, they just planted Sitka spruce monoculture on marginalized land. So you have like uplands and poor land that's boggy, thin soil, and all their planting is Sitka spruce. And I have to tell you, as someone who hiked and climbed in Ireland everywhere, before I ever came here, I detested this tree. Like, I mean, this is a blight on the landscape, I have to tell you, because look, it's a monoculture, there's nothing growing under it, they're all close together, they're in lines, you know, and they even, I was forgetting that even before I studied horticulture, when I was working as an illustrator, I illustrated these forestry brochures telling people how to plant trees and how to keep them 30 meters from riparian areas, from, you know, we have loads of ancient monuments in Ireland and on hilltops and everywhere, and how to keep them back. And we had no photographs of how to do, because they weren't doing it right, you know, I mean, but yet I've discovered even today, you know, it's still a problem. And what's happened is they've grown them, they're on poor soil, and they even decide, oh, we're going to have to fertilize it by helicopter. So the idea, I mean, and they should have known better, that this is phosphates, okay, on this poor, thin, wet soil, and they can't even go in and thin them because the soil is so poor, it's not worth growing them, you know, thinning them out to grow. So the policy is, oh, we're going to have to clear fell them. But what has happened is when they clear fell them, all this phosphate is released into the water, and it has, I think there's a certain type of freshwater mussel that has been grown extinct in certain areas. And so now they say, no, we can't do it. We have to be very careful how are they going to cut these without just wiping out the freshwater mussels entirely. So, you know, how not to do things. And even there's a particular area now into a county, it's a beautiful county, but it's very poor land, called County Leitrim in the northwest. And the people there are pushing back because everybody was buying land there. There must have been subsidies in the 70s and 80s and just planting, you know, a timber crop on it of Sitka spruce. And the people are saying, we're just surrounded by Sitka spruce, and it's dark and it's claustrophobic and it's unenvironmental. And so, you know, there's just people, it's just been how not to grow a tree. Take a tree out of its if you show the next, it wasn't until I came here and I hiked up the now this is, you know, the second, I think, biggest Sitka spruce in North America, or in America, I mean, this is where it would be, and it's in British Columbia. But my introduction to beautiful Sitka spruce was on Cascade Head, walking in some of the old growth forest there, and I said, oh wow, this is how they should look, and this is how they should be growing in an ecosystem. But when you take a plant out of its ecosystem and you just commodify it and turn it into a cash crop, you know, trouble happens. You know, look what we do when we disrupt that, and we're not smart about sustainable forestry and everything. So, yeah, so, and then you can move on. So, and then there are trees that have really changed Irish gardens, and I'm just going to talk about a couple of them. Now, I wonder what, you probably know this is Port Orford cedar. People know that plant? It's Chamaecyparis lawsoniana. In Ireland, it'd be called Lawson cypress. Okay, now, and the picture on the right is a really old one that's in Ireland. You know, it's probably over 100 years old. And Lawson was a friend of David Douglas's. David Douglas brings back the seed, gives it to his friend James Lawson, who's a farmer, who passes it on to the family nursery near Edinburgh and propagated it. And kind of the rest is history, because this plant has just been so successful as a garden plant or, you know, ornamental tree in Ireland. But it behaves, okay? It kind of, you know, it's not causing any problems. Not like the next one I want to tell you, and just take a deep breath and tell you this story because it's kind of interesting. So, I haven't looked up to see how they brought this back here, but anyway, so we have two plants here. Like talk about the two mother plants. They're two different conifers. And on the left, you've got, I don't know if you call it yellow cedar, Alaska cedar, maybe Nootka cypress. And on the right, you have Monterey cypress, okay? And the one on the left, I'm not even going to try and tell you what it's called because they keep changing the botanical name. You know, it's like, it's confusing when they keep doing that. But I would have known it as Chamaecyparis nootkitensis, say. And what happened is, these are two plants that were introduced into Great Britain, and this very wealthy banker called Christopher Leyland decided, his nephew got married in about 1845, decided to give him a wedding present of a mansion with a huge estate, okay, of land, and his nephew was really into gardening, and he gets this estate, as they were all doing then, planted up with all kinds of trees from North America and the Pacific Northwest. And these two trees that would never be near each other in nature are growing beside each other there. And because Monterey cypress is obviously down in California, and the Nootka cypress is from, you know, the traditional homeland of the Nukkunulf people up in Vancouver Island. But after about 30 years, the pollen from, I think it's from, because it goes both ways, the pollen from one of them landed on the female flower of the other one, and they had new babies, trees that were hybrids, okay? And they're called Leyland cypress, and they grow something like 50 feet in 14 years, okay? And they're these really bushy trees, and if you can go on to the next picture for me. And when I was a student in the Botanic Gardens in Dublin, and we'd see the Leyland cypress, and we'd just groan and roll our eyes, and we'd joke about how there should be a moratorium on nobody being allowed to plant any more of these trees in Ireland, because everyone had them for hedges, you know, forgetting that they're a big tree, you know. So this is what happens. So if you don't realize it, this is a terrace of houses, and this is in England. I found this in a newspaper article, and these are Leyland cypresses, and the neighbors, as you can imagine, are a bit unhappy about this. And what I discovered was, and I just want to make sure I get the quote right for this. Yeah, in the UK, and one of the names they call them is Leylandiais, are frequently the subject of litigation under the Anti-Social Behaviour Act of 2003. Okay. So, you know, so this is what happens when you mess with nature. So anyway, and though it's a very attractive tree, but you know, you have to be very careful where you plant it. So now I'm going to move away from the trees, and we're almost actually kind of done with the talk. I've got about a handful of slides, and I want to talk about, kind of do a bit of a turn here and talk about somebody, another Irish gardener, who has, and it's William Robinson. Oops. Sorry. We'll go back to the. So William Robinson is from Waterford in Ireland, and he in fact apprenticed in that very garden where you saw the tallest Sitka spruce in the world, in Ireland. And he, in fact, I've figured it out, like he's born in 1838. I reckon he was about the same age nearly as the Sitka spruce when he went there to apprentice as a young boy, you know, that one that's now 108 feet tall. And so he trained as a gardener, but he's known as the wild child of Victorian Britain. So I'll tell you what happened. He gradually, you know, obviously a smart guy. He made his way. He eventually ends up in Regent's Park Gardens in London, and he's in charge of the British wildflower section. And he loves native plants and wildflowers. And he actually becomes much more successful as a writer, because a little after that, he actually gets a job with the Times and starts writing for them. He goes off to France to write about a big gardening exposition or whatever over there. And he really gets their attention in Britain because he starts criticizing British gardens and how bad they are in comparison to the French gardens. And the reason for it is that at that time, you know, it's Victorian Britain, and the style of gardening, and this would be, you know, for big gardens, was to grow all these tender annuals, bright garish colors, have to be grown in greenhouses. And I know this because I'm still doing it when I was studying horticulture, you know, 100 years later or whatever. And they get wheeled out and planted up in these huge, you know, geometric patterns often of these bright colors, all the same plant, and then another geometric pattern with bright color, a different plant. And then they wheel out their subtropical plants from the greenhouses to put out for the summer in the gardens. And he abhorred this, and he said it was like lifeless, like a wallpaper or carpet. So it's kind of carpet bedding. And so he started writing about how we should be growing hardy perennials. He loved the natives and naturalizing. Now we all take this for granted now. It's very like how you do native plant gardening, I think, in an urban setting now. And you know, you don't have these rigid lines of plants and they all go together. But they somehow mix well. And he took a trip the year after the railway in North America from Chicago to California was opened. He headed over to the US, and he obviously had sponsorship to write all about his trip. And he took the train from Chicago to California with the express purpose of finding this plant, the cobra lily, of which it's painted here somewhere. Where is it?
It's
around
right
the corner.
around the corner, yeah.
And because he loved this plant, he was fascinated by it. And so he heads up into the Sierra Nevadas, and he gets out and finds it, and he starts digging it up. It takes loads of it because it is believed in England that they can't grow it, you know, in cultivation. And somehow he manages to keep it alive, and he has it in his luggage, and he's writing all about this. And he also collects, I don't know if you know, there's I forget what it's called, but it's another one of our tiger lilies. It's from it's native to southern Oregon as well, Lilium pardalinum. He also loves the penstemons, and there's another penstemon he collects, and they end up having, you know, garden varieties named for him. You see Robinsonii, because he brought them back too. And and I don't know if you noticed, this illustration is from 1871, from Curtis's Botanical Magazine. I didn't mention that Curtis's Botanical Magazine was started by William Curtis in the late 1700s, and it's still going. I think Kew Gardens sort of took it over now. It's the longest running botanical magazine, and there are all these wonderful botanical artists. And of course, Walter Hood Fitch is one of the most famous. And anyway, when he came back, he was collecting the plant too for Veitch's. It's a famous nursery in London, in Chelsea, and they grew the plants obviously. And this Walter Hood Fitch was able to draw it from the plants he brought back. So that's actually drawn from what he collected in the Sierra Nevadas and brought all the way back on the train and all the way back on the cruiser ship back to London. And he's a very busy man at this time, so he's writing, he sets up, you can go on to the next one. He writes a book called The Wild Garden, and this is actually, he became very successful and bought a beautiful house called Grave Tie, and started planting. And in fact, this is a modern day one that it's a restaurant now, seemingly, and the restaurateur and the garden was in disrepair for a while, and they've been bringing it back. But he wrote this book, I think, about 1870s. I don't know if he wrote it before or after his American trip, but I'm convinced, seeing all these amazing native plants, in the Sierra Nevadas and in North America or out in the West, had to inspire him even more to promote the idea of wild gardening and naturalized gardening. And someone else called him the guerrilla gardener. But the book he's best known for, he wrote later, is called The English Flower Garden. Now he's the one that really started the craze of English cottage gardening. It's out of that. And what I like about him, we've looked at, Mengus and Douglas were bringing all these plants back that went to these very wealthy landowners, for their estates. But William Robinson was writing for ordinary people, really. You could have a small garden and you could do this with your garden. You didn't have to be some big wealthy landowner. And if you could move on to it, he also, the very next year, he started his own garden illustrated weekly journal. I laugh at his, horticulture in all its branches, puns. But and even here he is, it's 60 years after David Douglas has introduced red flowering currant into Great Britain. It was one of those first plants with Salal and Mahonia, or tall Oregon grape, that he introduced. And he's obviously having someone illustrate it for him. And you can see they're all different colors, which means they're all different garden varieties that have been developed, after 60 years of it growing successfully. But even a few years after Douglas had introduced it, a famous English garden designer called, I think it was John Loudon, was describing how he saw it growing outside Reading Jail. Now, and obviously that's only a handful of years after it was introduced, and already it must be big enough to be this nice shrub. And I just think, gosh, they were planting nice red flowering currants outside jails, in England. But also, this is the way my mind works. I think the only thing I know about Reading Jail is that Oscar Wilde was sent there for 2 years hard labor, and he wrote the Ballad of Reading Jail. And I looked him up, and because I was thinking, God, did he ever see them growing there? Maybe he didn't get a chance on hard labor. But, Oscar Wilde was let out of Reading Jail in May 1897, which is when this illustration was done, which is when they might have been blooming. And so I just kind of think, oh, did he see them? Anyway, that's the way my mind works, sorry. I like making connections. So anyway, I think we're getting towards the close. So I should say that I thought my red flowering currant would be the end of my story, okay? And for this I started, but I was curious, what's going on now in Ireland with native plants from here? And I love camas lily, and it's one of the first plants I probably planted in my own native plant garden when I got here. And then I started learning all about their cultural significance, and the Kalapuya, it's where, we're down in Salem, and we're cultivating them, had these great vast, prairies of them. And so I was wondering, well, when did the camas come to Ireland? And so, you can go to the next one. So, first I see that, this is an illustration from Edwards Botanical Register, 1832. So, I know he did, this is another plant that Douglas introduced to Great Britain and Ireland. But I couldn't say for sure whether the illustrator was drawing from, a herbarium specimen, because they do such a fantastic job, with herbarium specimens, bringing them back to life, or whether they were drawing from a live specimen. I haven't found out yet. Would anyone like to guess where this photograph on the right is? Anyone, any ideas? Where it might be? This is kind of a trick question, by the way. There's a clue. County Cork, Ireland.
Wow.
So I Googled Camas in Ireland, whatever, and the first person who came up was Prince Charles in his Highgrove home, has these meadows, and Camas is all through it. So there is this, and so I'm on a WhatsApp sort of chat with all my old classmates from the Botanic Gardens. So I just thought, oh, wait a minute. And I put out a question, and any of you know Camas? You know, I gave him common, and I said, have you any stories about Camas? And one of the people sent me this. And he said, this is a friend of mine who's a horticulturist in Cork, and he sent me this. And it's Russell Landscaping, I don't know them, but, and then another one of my classmates said, oh, we have it growing around our pond, you know, where they live. And they're down in Cork too, actually. And then I said to him, I get the impression, is there a trend at the moment? Because I keep seeing these articles about how everybody is wanting to create wildflower meadows to attract pollinators. And my first response when I saw this, oh wow, Camas is in Ireland, you know, like it's been, then I go, oh my God, I hope it doesn't become invasive, you know, was my second thought. And also, you know, a lot of the theme of what I've been saying during this talk is that, you know, you take a plant from its ecosystem, and also an ecosystem that includes humans. I love what, there's a famous ethnobotanist from British Columbia called Wade Davis, and he writes a lot about, you know, he's lived with indigenous people in the Amazon and everything, and in his talks, and you can see him doing amazing TED Talks, he says we shouldn't be talking about the ecosphere, we should be talking about the ethnosphere. Because, and Greg Archuleta was really talking about this the other day, how, you know, environmentalists and conservationists were inclined to think of pristine nature as something that has no humans in it. And of course, there's this great idea of wilderness here in America that's part of your heritage. But in fact, wilderness is a bit of a myth if you think of it as this place that has no humans, because indigenous people have always been everywhere, you know, and they have, you know, the indigenous women of this area have, for thousands of years, been working with their landscape, their environment and the land to grow everything they need, and it's an interdependency. I finally learned that not only, you know, we need the plants, but they need us. You know, they need us to take care of them. So my other thoughts about this, and I was thinking, I remember saying to Janet while I was putting this together, God, I was thinking about, imagine the red flowering currant goes to Ireland and it no longer has its pollinators that it's co-evolved with. Was it lonely? Was my thought, you know? But I mean, I'm just thinking differently about it. But I had this thought this morning that, wow, but look, the camas and the red flowering currant, how generous is nature? You know, because when I looked up the red flowering currant, and it was on a blog in Ireland for wildflowers, because if you think about it, it's been growing in Ireland for 200 years, and it's naturalized. So it's considered one of the wildflowers there now. And how generous are the flowers, because they're providing pollen to all these new insects. They're not fussy. You know what I mean? They're not saying, oh no, you're not my type or whatever. And they're just the bounty of nature. But that we need to really think hard about what we do with plants and the stories we tell about them, and to give back, that it's a reciprocal. I think of it as a kind of a dance, you know, that we're dependent upon them and they're dependent upon us. So, and you can just, and with that, I will stop.
Huge.
I didn't even look to see how long. Oh, wasn't too bad.
Good.
No. Okay. So I don't know if you have any questions or comments, or give you a minute to think about it. Yeah.
I had a question about the botanical illustrations throughout.
Yeah.
What would have been the media? And they look so vibrant.
Okay, I think they used watercolor, but I think what the originals may have been watercolor, and then they did etchings, and then they were hand colored. Do you know what I mean? So for mass production.
Gotcha.
And when I first created this talk, it was a lot longer, and I realized, oh God, I have about 3 talks in this talk. And one of them I'd love to do sometime is, who were the botanical artists who did all this work? Because there is a story there too about women, in that, you know, like William Jackson Hooker was a wonderful botanical artist, and a lot of the men who are naturalists were really good at drawing. But the period I'm talking about saw women move from being sort of amateur botanical artists to professional artists. They arrived in a way as being recognized as professional artists. And some of the people you saw there, like the last one of the canvas is a woman called Sarah Ann Drake, and I was looking her up. She was, John Linley was a botanist working for the Horticultural Society that sent Douglas to, you know, the Pacific Northwest. And Douglas worked with him. When his stuff came back, Linley would be figuring it out. He founded that Edwards Botanical Register, and Sarah Ann Drake was a friend of his sister's. They'd gone to school together. So, you know, what you find is with the Hooker family, it was a family business, you know. William Jackson Hooker was a botanist. His son, Joseph Dalton, was more famous than him. Then his daughter married, or his granddaughter, Harriet, became a professional botanical artist, though she didn't do Pacific Northwest native, so I didn't have her in it. But she married then a guy who became the 3rd director of Kew Gardens. So, you know, there was this whole network of women artists who often were relatives, and, you know, I think they were probably educated too. You know, they would have been more upper class. At that stage, the education wasn't available for, you know, lower class women or whatever. But they were, you know, William Jackson Hooker, his whole family were involved in, I'd say, helping him create probably a huge herbarium, because he was the first official director of Kew Gardens, and then his son, and then his son-in-law. You know, like, it just goes on through families. But the women, I would love to do one, just how the women came in and started to be the ones who were doing the illustration, the botanical illustration. Yep, sorry. Anything else anyone would like to ask? Yeah.
The Sitka spruce
Yeah.
in Ireland, and how is that used as a commercial crop?
Well, to add insult to injury, okay. Ireland isn't hot enough in the summer for these trees to become huge, you know. So chipboard and MDF. I can't remember what that stands for, but you know that kind of mainly. And funny, at one stage I knew a guy who was studying engineering in Ireland, and he was a friend, and his kind of degree project was looking at Sitka spruce and how much of stress, I know injury, you know, but how much stress and how strong it was for construction, and he found it wasn't strong enough, kind of, you know, for roof trusses or whatever, you know. So, and they do grow lodgepole pine as well a bit, but it's mainly, Sitka spruce is the one that's really been grown, and they are changing. And Douglas fir is really grown in Scotland, because I think they grew them in better, deeper sandy soil in valleys, you know, and they have some of Douglas fir, you know, like the original seedlings growing there, yeah.
What was the native plant that was Ireland originally forested, and if so, what was
Okay,
it
so,
forested with?
yeah. So if you notice, Ireland is a little island off another island off a great landmass. And island ecologies, by their very nature, haven't got that much diversity, okay? So just to give you an idea, like when I was a student there, I had the little red book of all the native species in Ireland or whatever, and it's about 800. And I remember here on an internship, I was in the Smoky Mountains, and in the Smoky Mountains alone, there were 1,500 native species, you know, because this is a continent, okay? So, and Ireland has been, it's a third the size of Oregon, with a slightly larger population. And it has been farmed for 7,000 years. And you think of all the, you know, and it's been colonized sort of since, you know, gradually from about 1200s onwards. And the way the land is used has changed radically, and conventional farming and all this sort of stuff. So we do have native plants, but it's nothing like, you know, what's available here. And so that's why it's surprised they are, you know, using what we do have, But also Ireland is one of the least forested countries in the EU. It's got less than 10%. I mean, it's really small. And we only have 2 native conifers. There's Scots pine and the yew. And so, for timber and forestry, they're really interested in bringing in other species. We have 2 native species of oak tree, which are extremely slow growing. And they can live, there's one up the road from where I grew up, and it's about 700 years old, the king tree. But it is true that, as part of the British colony, it was an economy of extraction, using the trees, particularly in the 1600s, to build Elizabeth I's navy, and all that. But I think the Irish overstated too sometimes, because we could be doing a much better job of reforesting, and part of those brochures that I produced, they were supposed to put in 20% broadleaf trees, but I don't know if they've ever achieved that, when they reforest and they put like a band of these broadleaf trees around the outside and have all the conifers on the inside. And they are saying, well, we all have to have, be able to do carbon sink, and they're saying, well, the Sitka spruce will do a carbon sink, but I don't think they've got the right answer yet, doing that, but yeah.
So was the Douglas fir named after David Douglas?
Yes, sorry, it was, yeah.
We have a Menzies in the exhibit here, a Menzies, something named after
Yes, it was.
Menzies.
Yeah,
Kipps.
there's a shrub named
Yeah.
after Menzies.
Actually, it's one of the award winners, I think, right? One of the,
Is it? I didn't notice it.
I think it was one of the merits.
Menzies,
Yeah.
Menzies, yeah. Who, do you remember who painted?
It's Kip. Tolmia.
Oh, Menziesii. Yeah, Tolmia. Yeah, the what I call piggyback plant or youth on age or
Mhm.
whatever. Actually, that's grown as an indoor potted plant in Ireland. So, yeah. Any other? Yeah.
Along with the, just the specimens and propagation, bringing back to Ireland and the other European countries, did they also bring back the knowledge of the medicinal uses and the basketry that could, different things like that?
I don't have any record of them talking about, actually, well, a lot of the, like for instance, David Douglas, not only was he collecting plants, but, he was trying to collect ethnobotanical information and about the culture and how they use the plants, but I didn't see it translated into medicine or using it, but then we have this issue where, I think ethnobotany was a very young science then too, and what has happened is that the ethnobotanists, being Western male scientists, they all, collected all this stuff, and I didn't say is that Thomas Jefferson, like so many of his peers who were in leadership or power at the time, and probably Britain too, believed that the indigenous people were going to die out. They just believed they were an inferior race genetically. We had all this wacky pseudoscience of eugenics idea, and it was the early, even though Charles Darwin hadn't come out with his Origin of the Species, they were already thinking about that kind of thing. And they just said, well, and Washington said this, well, they're going to die out, so we'll have all the land. But it also meant that people who wanted to, ethnobotanists and anthropologists, I was trying to think of, they all thought, oh, if they're all going to die out, we better collect everything now, and we better record everything. And they actually took the stuff from, you know what I mean? They'd collect it and they'd bring it back to British museums. So you have that approach, and now, I don't know if there's a museum, I would recommend seeing if it's open at the Confederate Tribes of Grand Ronde. They have Spirit Mountain Casino, it's on the road between Salem and Lincoln City. But they have a museum, Chachalu, and I was there a couple of years ago, and they actually had on loan from British Museum all these things that a British Reverend so-and-so had collected from the indigenous people. In that, they call it the collector's period or something. There's a name for it, when they took all these things and brought them back. So you know, all of this is a very complicated story, you know. And I have to tell you too that, you know, even though Ireland was colonized, I saw in research for this, I came across an article just in the last year or whatever, and it's all sparked by George Floyd and the racial reckoning. And there's a commission now in Ireland because someone asked the question, well, what do we have in Ireland in our museum collections and in the Botanic Gardens that would be questionable about maybe slavery or taking things from indigenous people, you know what I mean? So everybody, you know, this idea is alive and being thought of. And I think they didn't give the authority or the, you know, the indigenous knowledge is only now, and it's great. I mean, because it's not an all bad story, but it's only now are we beginning to understand that there are different ways to get to the truth and the reality of things, and it's not just Western science. And what I didn't tell you too was that, remember Chief Concomely? Like when Douglas visited, it was in his first expedition, so he headed back to England in 1827. Like an epidemic swept through this area in 1829 and 30. 90% of the indigenous people died. Think of that, 9 out of 10. And when Douglas came back for his second expedition about 1830, and he talks about, he never mentions Concomely again or any of his family, so we just assume they all died. And and other journalists are describing dead bodies around. I mean, it just wiped people out. And that was another reason where, you know, ethnographers then and anthropologists saying, oh, they're all dead. And, you know, we have this firstism and lastism where, you know, the pioneers and the first to see this place, or the first to collect that, but then they have these curses, or whoever we do for, here's the last Kalapuya woman, or the last this, you know, Chinook person, when in fact they're still here, you know. And that's the one thing that indigenous people I hear on the radio say, you know, if you want to know anything about us, just know we're still here, you know, it's not gone. So I don't know if I'm following my train of thought here, right? But yeah, it's amazing what I've learned from just following the story of the plants, you know. And it's given me I mean, I think they're all beautiful, you know, and I love them. But there's such a deeper story when you go into the human relations and connections to the plants, and ours too, you know, as botanical artists and people growing the plants, you know. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wonderful.